Hi there, it's Ian here, and you're watching Grumpy Opinions, the show where I'm going to tell you all about what I think of films, TV shows, games, and life in general. Let's get on with the show. Outlander is a Starz Entertainment TV show about Claire and Jamie Fraser, a time traveller and a Highlander, poised on the brink of the Battle of Culloden. Episode 12, The Hail Mary, finds us a full 5 months down the line from the previous episode, and the army is regrouped near Inverness, starving and weary after being dogged by the British Army all winter. Everyone's a bit wappet and hungry, so Jamie, who's Bagsy of the Big House, sends Dougal off to scout for the British Army, and then chats with Claire and Myrta about the fact that the date of the Battle of Culloden's only 3 days away. Anyway, Claire's running short on medical stuff, so she pops up to an apothecary in Inverness, but when she gets there, she bumps into wee Mary Hawkins. Turns out in the last while since they've met at Sandringham's house, Mary ended up getting shacked up with Cough-along Alex Randall, and is none too pleased to have found out that Claire tried to keep them apart. Meanwhile, at Prince Charles' War Council, the quartermaster John is all for having the battle at Culloden, until Jamie sweeps in and points out that it's going to be a slaughter, since they don't have the arms and the artillery to fight a pitched battle on flat ground. The general ends up siding with him, and Jamie gives a rousing speech about seizing the moment once they get more French gold. But the bonny prince wants to put an end to it all, and with God on his side he can't see himself failing. Claire isn't doing much better, having arrived at the boarding house where Mary and Alex are staying, finds that he's on the way out. He's coughing up blood and gunge and doing his best to look like Brad Pitt in Into the Vampire. Ugh. And then who but Black Jack Randall appears at the door, wearing his civvy gear and looking all confused, and it turns out that Big Bad BJ's been paying for their every need this whole time. And Claire breaks it to Mary that Alex is going to be a goner, and Mary drops a pregnancy grenade. And Claire leaves, BJ stops her in the street, begging her to help his little brother with witchy medical knowledge from the future, but all she can do is ease his suffering, and she agrees, as long as he'll tell her where the British Army's camped. And Jamie's a bit cross when he hears about this, but he's glad of the info and sent scouts out to verify it. And that's when Colm appears, looking frail and more crippled than ever, and he's come to see Dougal and Jamie, and also asks Claire if she can help him die quickly, because he's in a lot of pain. And when Dougal does finally get back, there's all sorts of arguments, because Colm ends up naming Jamie as successor as clan's chief, till his own son's old enough. And that annoys Dougal, and Jamie tries to play it out alright, but there's really nothing doing, Colm's mind's made up. And it gets later worse when a drunk Dougal starts pouring his heart out finally to his brother, only for Colm to finally slip away to death in the midst of the conversation, leaving Dougal alone with his grief unspoken and unforgiven. Claire's also having a troubling time, because as well as keeping Alex breathing with thorn apple smoke, Alex also asks that BJ marry Mary Hawkins to make sure that her well-being and safety are looked after, and that of the baby. Oh dear. But it turns out BJ isn't having any of that. And when Claire confronts him, it turns out that he's terrified of the death curse she laid him in season 1. And they think, because he knows that he's going to die at Culloden. And he also kind of worries because he knows that he's an evil monster and that he might end up hurting Mary at some point. But finally, he does go through with it. And as Alex lies dying, and almost as soon as the vows are exchanged, Riek breathes his last. And in the horror of it all, BJ starts punching the crap out of his brother's corpse, as you do. Jamie, on the other hand, is having more success because he manages to convince the generals to lead a sneak attack on the British camp during the night in a pincer move, because that's wiser than the Battle of Culloden. But then the quartermaster, John, insists that he wants to lead one of the arms of the troops with the Bonnie Prince. But they end up getting lost, and they leave Jamie and the general with no choice but to retreat and face the surety of a massacre at Culloden. So what did I think? Well, this week's all been about drama, and about brothers, and about forgiveness, grief, reparations, and sacrifice. And with some amazing acting work from the ever-reliable Gary Lewis and Graham McTavish. In fact, for me, the absolute highlights of this episode were the scenes with Colm. Both his quiet moments alone with Claire, and then later with Dougal. And of course, the big scene with Jamie and Dougal talking about the succession of Clan Mackenzie. Gary's a great actor and a well-kent face in Scottish TV and cinema, and he's brought a great deal of talent and gravitas to the show. And the same goes for Graham McTavish. We got to see some new sides of Dougal this week, the caring, softer side, and, the heartbroken affection he shows for his brother, finally spoken, even though he was saying it to a dead man. It was also a really nice week for the brothers Randall, with Tobias being his ever-reliable self, but also managing to play drunk better than anyone I've seen since Dean Martin in Some Came Running. It's also great that things are finally tying up with the conundrum of Black Jack and Mary's wedding. It's finally been explained. And to me, that's also been the final nail in the coffin of the hopes to save the day at Culloden, because you see, the nerdy time of this time travel aspect has been something that I've been thinking about a lot during the show, wondering whether, you can really change the past, or if it's fixed, and if Claire's presence in history is actually a part of history already. And it feels like the show's answered that now, because, see, the way I see it, Claire always went back in time. That's how it's supposed to happen. This isn't like Back to the Future where you can change it. It's 12 Monkeys where no matter what you do, that was what already happened. And it's the fixed point, the idea, rather than flux points. I'll not get into that anymore, but that's all I have to say on it. And it's also all I'm going to say about the good things on the episode, because this is Grumpy Opinions time. And speaking of time, I was more than a bit miffed that the timeline managed to skip forward 5 months. I mean, 5 months. It's not a couple of days. And what happened in that time? I mean, the episode suddenly jumped forward. I mean, from the end of the last episode when, they were killing Sandringham with an axe, and now suddenly it's 5 months later. And yet, the way it's played, it feels like it might as well be the next day. I mean, take, for example, Rupert's wee chat with Ross. I mean, that didn't feel like 5 months later. That felt like, a couple of days later, or, a week past Tuesday. I mean, that kind of point where Rupert's finally stopping talking about Angus and kind of regarding as Ross as his new pal. That's not 5 months. That's a couple of weeks. It just didn't feel right. I didn't buy that passage of time it happened. And part of the reason this all bugs me is that I know that Claire has to be at the Standing Stone sometime in the next couple of days because, she doesn't know how Culloden turns out. But she also knows that she's pregnant and she's got a weird looking ring. And now surely most of that's going to end up being next week's episode stuff. But I feel like some of this should have been set up here. And it completely escapes me why they did this as a 13-episode season rather than a 16-episode season like season 1, when they've definitely had to cut great chunks out of the book to speed the story on. But then at the same time, they end up making time skips forward, and it makes things feel a bit awkward and fake, and they have to bulldoze through plot development and character arcs really quickly. I mean, another thing about this is that it has a loose and weird feeling when sometimes you have bits like the whole Alex and Mary, Claire and BJ stuff. Now, that wasn't bad, but I feel like that could have been spread over 2 or 3 episodes in a big build-up to Culloden. I mean, we could have really stretched this out, and it wouldn't have been bad, given everyone a little bit of time and breathing room. And this is kind of similar to the previous complaint, but the result of it is that we see people like Mary, and she suddenly turns up all angry and a bit more grown up and more insensible and more self-assured than we saw her last time, and tougher, presumably as a result of having seen, like, the guy who ordered her getting raped had his head cut off with an axe. I mean, that'll toughen you a bit. But she had like maybe 10 lines, and the guy playing Alex had even fewer, unless, you count hacking cough as dialogue. Now, sure, these are secondary characters, and this story's always been about Claire and BJ and Jamie, but I feel like this episode was kind of a bit overstuffed. There's too many storylines crowbarred into it to the point where it got exhausting, and not in a really good way. The saving grace, I mean, was that there was that really long scene with Dougal monologuing, to Colm, and Colm dying in the midst of it. I mean, that was great, and that really kind of brought things back down after so many bitty scenes. But after that, boom, we're right back into BJ punching a corpse, and then the really hasty bit about Jamie saving the day, that little feint. And it was a feint, a feint with an E in it. Because, that whole idea of suddenly out of nowhere he goes, let's do a pincer move on the British troops. And that reprieve just comes out of absolutely nowhere and immediately dies on its arse. I mean, for me, that felt a bit careless and slapdash. I mean, I know they kind of vaguely set it up by saying, oh, my scouts have found this out. But you knew that it wasn't going to work the moment that Irish John insisted that he and Charlie lead the other wing of the army. And you know how we know that? Because anytime anyone except Claire takes agency away from Jamie in the story, unless he gives it up himself, like when he gave himself up to BJ, whatever that is, it's going to doom to fail. Because that's how this kind of story works. It's a bit like last week I was talking about him doing the heroic things. Well, that kind of grandstanding, it gets really predictable. I mean, you see it in a lot of books and a lot of writing, not just in stuff by Diana Gabaldon. I mean, it happens in a lot of heroic stuff. As soon as the hero has somebody else take away a bit of their agency, quite often it'll fail because the hero didn't do it themselves. Now, again, I'm not ragging on Jamie. It's just, it felt to me like that bit was a bit predictable. I mean, I just knew that as soon as the words left that guy's mouth, I was like, well, clearly this isn't going to work because that guy's going to stuff it up somehow. Anyway, there was a lot to love this week, and I have mentioned, I really liked a lot of it. And that's us almost at the end of the series now. So until next week's finale episode, I've been Ian, and these have been my grumpy opinions.